All right, good afternoon, everyone. This is Dr. Patrick Lockwood coming back to you live again to talk about more science of wellness. Because, again, the concept I want to continue to speak with you guys about is wellness and not simply just one facet of being healthy. Because there are a lot of things we can do to be healthy in terms of our diet, in terms of our mental health, which is kind of my specialty, and, you know, our relationships, our family, our friends, our work, our hobbies, our play, all these things are extremely important. And I kind of avoided the physical realm for a long time with you guys simply because, it's not my specialty. I'm not a physician. I don't have a lot of room to speak in that regard, but there is a fair amount of research from what I found that focuses on, how exercise can benefit our mental well-being. So I'm going to speak today just a little bit on what the research in psychology in particular has discussed in terms of mental health, wellness, and our ability to use exercise to kind of bolster our mental health and wellness. And the research is actually kind of very straightforward for the most part, so you're not going to hear me kind of hedging or using too many caveats at this time. Although there are a few, but the research is actually very straightforward. So this should be a relatively short video, and again, if you have any questions or concerns about the research I'm discussing or contrasting opinions, please feel free to leave them here in the comments section or reach out to me at my Patreon, which I have a link up above here. But other than that, let's get going. So here's the landscape of today's talk. I want to first talk about just what are the various types of research that we can all engage in? And then what does the research say about kind of, the exercise and the benefits and things of that nature? So I'll talk about the types of exercise and the research benefits, and then I'll talk about how exercise affects the brain to the best of our knowledge. Because again, I'm always going to try and bring you some brain because it's the main organ in our body that runs the ship. And then finally, I'll leave you with some helpful caveats and hedges and ideas about how to incorporate exercise into your life if you're currently not doing that, or maybe you're doing it a certain way that might not be good for you. I'll just leave some basic ideas out there, even though I'm not a physical therapist or a physician, so I'm not going to try and speak as if I were. I'm just going to talk about what the research says, and then you can consult with your medical health professional or a personal trainer if you have one or know of one, and they can give you some more detailed points and tips and things to look at. So there are a lot of myths about exercise in terms of, how much is good for you. The federal government website says 45 minutes a day of moderate intensity exercise is good for you, and all adults should be engaging in it. In fact, all kids should be too. And to some extent that's true. And that doesn't necessarily conflict with what's in the research. However, specifying a predetermined amount of time and a perfect type of exercise is kind of a risky idea, so I don't necessarily agree with that, because we're all built differently physically. It's just impossible to recommend a perfect general guideline for any person. So, the federal government has a good basic rule, which is do something moderately active for a consistent period of time consistently throughout the week. That's good. But how much, how long, what kind is going to depend upon your bodily needs and your pre-existing health conditions and other things of that nature. So I'm going to stay away from the medical side of it, and let's just talk about, just generally speaking, what are the various types of exercise that we can engage in. So the two most obvious and most discussed types are aerobic exercise and anaerobic exercise. So aerobic exercise is typically discussed as like cardio and running and riding a bike and things of that nature, whereas anaerobic exercise is usually thought of like resistance training and weightlifting and all that good bro stuff that's so fun to do, so you can be all big and whatnot. So those are the two first kind of commonly discussed types of exercise, especially in the Western world. And there is just so much research out there on those various types of exercise in the American Academy of Sports Physiology and Sports Medicine and medical journals, things like that. And there's so much to read because they're constantly looking at different variables within how much cardio we need or how much anaerobic is good for us and bad for our heart. They're constantly looking at the downside of steroids and weightlifting. People who are trying to be very, very big, and there's this trend in the research and the medical and the American Academy of Sports Medicine and Physiology that says people who do intense amounts of anaerobic exercise, generally speaking, and especially people who use steroids and other supplements of that nature, kind of the illegal ones that are really bad for your heart, people who work out like that actually are likely to die earlier than people who do more moderate intensity cardio and moderate anaerobic exercise on the lower side. Now, I'm not going to speak to that idea too much because, again, it's not what I was predominantly here to research, but it's just something to think about. If you're one of those people out there who is very much interested in becoming a bodybuilder or becoming, big and kind of overly masculine or threatening or whatever, that's cool and you'll look good and you'll be attractive and whatnot, but there might be some downsides to that, especially in terms of your cardiovascular health. I'm not going to speak to that more, just a thought, a caveat. Please think about that if that's where you're heading. So let's talk about the general psychology, physiology research benefits of exercise. But before I do that, I'm going to nod to kind of non-traditional forms of exercise here in the West, things like yoga and Tai Chi and whatnot, because those are more kind of Eastern traditions and ways of being physically active. And there is some research I'll discuss here in a minute that proves, or at least points to the idea that there is some benefit to doing these kinds of more mindful flowing exercises. So those are kind of the three types of exercise. We have aerobic, anaerobic, and then kind of more mindful movement-based exercise like yoga and Tai Chi. So here are the research benefits from, I think I surveyed pretty much from 2017 back to like 2000, 1999. I didn't want to go much further back because I try and keep up to date and current, and I don't want to get into stuff from the 80s and the 70s and stuff because some of that's been disproven or modified. So I'm going to try and keep to like the last 15, 17 years of research. So basically, the overall general benefits that you might see on like the Mayo Clinic's website or other websites, things like when we exercise appropriately for our body weight and our type and our cardiovascular needs, we get better sleep, we have increased interest and better performance in sex, we have better endurance over the day, it's good for stress relief, it helps improve mood, it generally helps us feel more energetic throughout the day, we generally feel less tired and more mentally alert, it helps with weight control, and it helps with cardiovascular fitness and dealing with things like cholesterol and heart disease. So those are kind of the overall general benefits. Now I want to kind of shift into specifically what the research says about the mental health and wellness benefits of exercise, kind of more in my profession, in my train of thought, in my camp here. So a lot of times you hear people say, like, when I exercise, I'm more alert, which is absolutely true according to the research. And what it finds is that there's a fair amount of research about exercise and memory. And there's a strong correlation between appropriate, consistent, moderate exercise and enhanced memory function. And when I talk about the brain stuff later, I'll talk about specifically why that might be. Now, to that point, if you're someone who has experienced a trauma, for instance, and you exercise consistently, regularly, et cetera, it might actually make your more unpleasant, traumatic memories, if you have like flashbacks and things like that, it might actually make you experience them in a more vivid way. There's some research on that. So PTSD and exercise is good for you, but it also can make your memories more vivid because exercise enhances our memory process. And kind of the general, trend in the research for the last 20 plus years is that exercise does reduce anxiety and does help with depression. Now, the extent to which it helps is kind of questionable. A lot of the designs and the studies that are done are kind of inconsistent and not replicated very consistently or in a thorough way. So it might have you doing different kinds of exercise, different periods of time for exercising, things like that. So there's a caveat there that although it helps with anxiety and depression, kind of similar to being on meds, that's what the research shows, or similar to doing decent therapy, it's not a cure for anxiety or depression. So I'm not going to sit here and say that that's preposterous. The research also shows that exercise generally increases our sense of self-esteem, either through physical means like our body looks better so we feel better about ourselves, or that we feel more energetic and active and we're more engaged in our daily process so we feel better about ourselves as well. Another research find, and this is going to be kind of more on the caveat side of things. So there's a growing trend over the last 10 years where the research in different journals is focusing on green exercise. And what they mean by that is exercising outdoors in kind of green environments. So for instance, I ran 5 miles this morning out on the street in my neighborhood, and there's lots of trees everywhere. That would be considered a green exercise. So what they're saying is, in the research, that people who exercise in green environments, even compared to just in a gym, in a closed space, things like that, actually experience more benefit in terms of self-esteem and more benefit in terms of anxiety reduction and depression reduction. So that's a newer trend, and there's no specific hypothesis or kind of reason for that. The kind of evolutionary explanation I've been reading about is that we're biologically designed to be outside. We're not really designed to live indoors all day like we do. We work indoors, we hang out indoors, we live indoors. We're not really designed for that. So the standing theory is something about how our brain is designed in terms of seeing colors and being outside and experiencing fresh air and things of that nature actually helps lift our mood because it's more like what our natural environment is supposed to be. Now, it's a very, not flimsy, but it's a very unsubstantiated theory at this time, but it's just something to think about. I know, for instance, that I feel a little bit more energetic when I'm outside exercising versus when I'm at the gym. But just something to think about. More of the research here. It also shows that there's a decreased risk for neurodegenerative disorders, so things like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's that are kind of scary and becoming more prevalent nowadays. The research is showing that people who engage in moderate exercise, typically of an aerobic type, are more likely to stave off the symptoms of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, even if they have a predisposition for it. And finally, I want to go back to talking about the research on kind of the alternative forms of exercise that have been around a lot longer than running and weightlifting, but things like yoga and Tai Chi, kind of more mindful movement exercises. For the last 15 or so years, medical journals and the American Academy of Sports Medicine and Physiology have been looking at the benefits of Tai Chi and yoga. And for yoga in particular, there is a substantial group of research around what yoga can do for the brain and what yoga does for our well-being and our mental health, and specifically about anxiety. And there's a pretty strong correlation between consistent participation in yoga of various types and decreased anxiety. And the reason for that is because when people are doing yoga, generally speaking, that activates the opiate system and the GABA system, which are the main feel safe, calm down parts of the brain. So that is the gist of the research in psychology, not necessarily medicine, about how beneficial exercise can be. And just to note, at this point, I haven't described what amount or intensity or frequency of exercise will give you these benefits, simply because there's no standard protocol, like I said earlier. So this is really a decision you have to make in conjunction with your physician and a personal trainer and things of that nature, so that you can design the routine that works best for your mental health. Because, if you're 5'2" and 100 pounds, you might be able to run longer or, do more sit-ups or whatever than someone who is 6'8" and 310. That might be, you might have different physiology, different physical needs, different risks for heart issues, things like that. So it's really important to deal with a physician in designing some kind of exercise regimen. And now let's talk about the brain, because I've made some statements here about mental health and wellness and physical health as well at the beginning. And I think it's important to talk about why that might be. So the general research on brain functioning and when we exercise is, again, still kind of on the newer side. Most of the articles that I have here are between kind of 2007 and 2017, so it's a little newer. We haven't been doing too many brain scans apparently. But what we found so far is that, generally speaking, when people exercise, there are a variety of chemicals that are released. And they're chemicals related to the growth and the maintenance of the neurons, the wires in our brain. So, for instance, the research is showing that moderate levels of exercise will release something called BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. This is one of the chemicals that allows our brain to either repair or grow new connections when parts of the neuron are stimulated by other parts of another neuron that's connecting to it. And then there are other kind of growth factors that are stimulated when we exercise. Here's the other thing that exercise generally does to the brain. So I'm not going to talk about specific parts of the brain. I'm just going to talk about the general metabolic process of the brain. Because just like our gut, there's a metabolism. There's also a metabolism in our brain for different chemicals and processes. So what happens is when we exercise, typically we're getting more oxygen in, higher heart rate, etc., which typically means, unless you have like really bad cardiovascular health, you're getting more oxygen up to your brain, which means better oxygenation, i.e. healthier cells in the brain. And also what this does, and probably why it helps with anxiety and depression and self-esteem so much, is because all the neurotransmitters, like if you take an antidepressant like an SSRI, you're taking something revolving around serotonin and messing with serotonin. Or you might be taking a dopamine-based drug. Or if you're taking an anti-anxiety pill, you might be messing with your GABA system or your norepinephrine system. So all those meds work on these chemical messenger systems in the brain. And what happens is when we exercise, we're actually increasing the efficiency of the metabolic recycling process that happens with all those neurotransmitters I just mentioned, like GABA and serotonin and dopamine and norepinephrine. So basically, exercise allows us to have a better metabolic cycle for our mood chemicals in the brain, which is cool because, again, I've talked about sleep and how that can mess with the metabolic cycles of, our mood process and things like that. And it shows consistently across the research that, if we exercise, it actually helps get that metabolic process more online and more active in a way that's healthy for our brain. Because mental health disorders, essentially, are kind of either an accumulation of too much of a neurotransmitter or neurotransmitters, or too little of neurotransmitters being present. So if we exercise appropriately, theoretically, we can get that metabolic process back to a normal sense of homeostasis. So that's the brain research on exercise. So I hope all this makes sense. I know it's a little bit shorter, which is fine. And I just want to put this out there that, again, the research is constantly evolving. The new trend in the psychology literature about exercise and what's good for us is something called high-intensity interval training, which a personal trainer can explain to you. And that's kind of the new trend, and they're thinking that's maybe better than cardiovascular exercise that's really intense, like running 6 miles or something. So it's evolving, and the point is, in order for us to really do this wellness thing right, and especially the physical wellness thing right, that involves appropriate diet, appropriate exercise, things like that. And in terms of, just real quick, the social role of exercise, we're evolved creatures to play. we're really not designed necessarily to exercise. So we're designed to move to serve a purpose. So exercising is kind of against our evolutionary programming. However, it's using our play system in the brain. So like when we exercise with a friend, like I do during the work week with my friend and colleague, I kind of have a play experience with him, which is not only good for my mood because I'm playing with him by exercising, but it's also good for my mood because of the metabolic stuff I've just been talking about. So another kind of simple tip that might help everyone if you're struggling to exercise is maybe find a buddy to work out with, because it kind of makes it easier. You have kind of more external motivation, and it also helps with depression and helps release opiates in the brain because we're being socially connected. So this is the spiel on exercise. I'll post all the research, as I always do, on Patreon here in a minute. I hope you have a great day. I hope you've gotten something out of this. I know I've kind of been very simple and straightforward here. And again, it's not my wheelhouse. I'm not a physician, so I can't speak too intensely about it or authoritatively. So I hope you have a great day again. And I will talk to you all soon next week for another chat on wellness, mental health, and how to live a better life. Thanks, guys.